great pleasure to be the tech person for today's conversation. We have the great pleasure of having this talk series finished, our kind of the dessert in the form of a talk by Ela Przybylo, who is probably one of the most important people in asexuality studies, and she will be presenting on her most recent publication on asexuality. And today's talk, because American Study Center has its own asexuality expert, Dr. Anna Kurowicka, so she will be the one moderating. In terms of technicalities, I would ask everyone to mute their mics and communicate in the chat. After the presentation, we will have time for Q&As, and you can either unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can also indicate in the chat that you want to ask a question, and either Anna Kurowicka or I will let you know that you can speak or write. So don't worry about that. And Anna, the floor is yours.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I am going to repeat after Marta that it is my great pleasure to welcome Ela here. I think we're all a little bit disappointed because we were hoping to make it a live event and a longer one as well, but hopefully nothing is lost and this will happen next year. And on the plus side, of course, we have a lot of international listeners with us today. So, you know, you win some, you lose some, I suppose. But I'm really excited to have Ela with us. We've known each other for a few years now, and we've worked together, and she has been one of the people who have shown me that other people are also interested in asexuality studies, which was an exciting discovery to make. So let me just introduce her briefly. Ela Przybylo is an assistant professor in the Department of English and core faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies program at Illinois State University. She's the author of Asexual Erotics, Intimate Readings of Compulsory Sexuality, which we can see in the slides, published with Ohio State University Press in 2019. And let me add, we have the book at the American Study Center. Well, technically speaking, I have it on my shelf now, but it is in our library, and I'll be happy to share it with those who are interested. She's also an editor of On the Politics of Ugliness, published in 2018 with Palgrave. Ela is a founding and managing editor of the peer-reviewed open access journal, an independent journal, Feral Feminism. So Ela, the floor is yours. I'll do my best to stay on top of the questions, and I'm looking forward to the lecture and the Q&A both.
Amazing, thank you. I want to say that the joy of doing a talk with a Polish university is that for once my name gets pronounced correctly. So it's really delightful to hear. As you can imagine, that doesn't usually happen in North America. I want to thank the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw, and in particular, Anna Kurowicka, Marta Usiekniewicz, and Agnieszka Kotwasińska for organizing this. Thank you, you three, very much. So the first thing I just want to briefly do is tell you about where I am, because it can be really unclear. So what happened is that I teach in Central Illinois, and that's where I live for most of the year, but I happened to get stuck in Canada for the pandemic. So I am currently residing in the place where I grew up, which is Edmonton, and you can see it there with a circle on the slide. It's on Treaty 6 territory. And basically, Canada consists of 11 treaties that were established in the late 19th and early 20th century to try to form agreements between the Indigenous nations here and the Crown. And those treaties aren't always honored, but it is sort of a sign of respect and gratitude to do a land acknowledgement in the context of the treaty that you exist in. So like I said, Edmonton is on Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. So before I start, I'm going to talk about three artists, which don't really have that much relevance to each other, but which I think are really interesting and relevant for asexuality. And so can everyone hear me okay? I should do a double check. Okay, awesome. So the first artist I want to talk about is Agnes Martin. So Agnes Martin was an abstract expressionist originally from Saskatchewan in Canada, moved to New York, and then moved to New Mexico, the Mexico desert in the 60s, where she became this really reclusive artist figure and lived there for many years. She's been really embraced as a queer and lesbian artist, with little examination as to how her asexuality is also part of her queerness and lesbianism. So I write about her in a piece I wrote with Danielle Cooper. And one of the things we found is she would make these statements like, real love is when you're not making love and you still love each other. So, you know, really unacknowledged kind of asexual, potentially artist figure who was queer, not only queer and asexual, but also queer because of her asexuality. The second figure is Andy Warhol. So obviously well-known part of the pop art movement, queer icon, and often narrated as a highly sexual artist with lots of partners. I was recently on a master's thesis defense for Harley Guo at Emily Carr University in Vancouver, and their project was research practice-based, meaning that it was part art and part kind of art theorizing, so it was a combination of mediums. And part of their project was called Andy Warhol as Aro Ace. And they argued really compellingly that there's evidence that Andy Warhol was both asexual and aromantic. And some of the kind of evidence they had for this were quotes such as, I'd rather laugh in bed than do it. And some people get energy from sex and some people lose energy from sex. I have found that it's too much work. So those are Warhol's words. And then finally, Yayoi Kusama. So a well-known contemporary Japanese artist, part of the pop art movement in the 60s in New York, though often her work was unacknowledged and also easily thieved by other artists. She works a lot with polka dots. She also did these phallic soft sculptures. And she has really interesting things to say, both in her like biographies and when you see films of her. She talks about making penises in order to heal her feelings of disgust towards sex. Reproducing the objects again and again was her way of conquering the fear, Kusama wrote in her autobiography. She was terrified of sex and of the phallus. Her fear was of the hide in the closet trembling variety. So really fascinating, very, different, obviously 3 artists from different art movements. And I could really go on with different artists and figures and films and literary examples that have strong nodes of asexuality and aromanticism, but that are really never viewed in that way. So what's really interesting for me is how is it that queer scholars are so bad at spotting asexuality and aromanticism? Why is it that a disinterest in sex is not often leveraged towards queer theorizing? And why is it that we read queerness through compulsory sexuality and through sex? So those are some of the overriding questions that I wanted to start with. One way to think about how queerness is theorized is through the idea of the conceptual toolkit. Traditionally, asexuality and aromanticism have just not been seen as conceptual elements that need to be found in the queer and or erotic toolkit. When I talk about a toolkit, I'm inspired by Sarah Ahmed's Killjoy Survival Kit from her book, Living a Feminist Life, and a book I taught last semester, Elizabeth Alksesser's Restricted Access, Media, Disability, and the Politics of Participation. And you should see both those cover images there. So a toolkit consists of self-compiled tools. Each toolkit is highly different and highly personalized. The tools in a toolkit can be used in various arrangements. Each tool is distinct, but also fits into this larger whole. So it's open to various uses and applications, and it's portable. So it provides this, very capacious, and I think previously used, obviously, metaphor for thinking about how we do theory, or how we really think about anything in particular, including erotics. So I want to suggest today that asexuality and aromanticism contribute to our erotic toolkit. That learning about asexuality and aromanticism is necessary for queer practitioners who want to have a robust toolkit. Ahmed writes, the experiences we have give us resources. The experiences of folks who are asexual and or aromantic provide resources for building up an erotic toolkit that can effectively critique systems of sex, sexuality, and romanticism, and their connections to systems of power. Ahmed goes on to write about the kit. We will accumulate different things, have our own stuff. We can peer into each other's kits and find in there someone else's story. But I think the point of the kit is not just what we put in it, it is the kit itself, having somewhere to deposit those things that are necessary for our survival. So I invite all of you to incorporate knowledge about asexuality and aromanticism and their critiques of compulsory sexuality and amatonormativity into your kits. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So a few terms. The first term that you've already heard me use and that I will use throughout and also unpack later on further is compulsory sexuality. So this term stems from Elizabeth Evans, who's a legal scholar. She draws on Adrian Rich's really well-known term, compulsory heterosexuality. The term compulsory sexuality speaks to the ways in which sexuality is presumed to be natural and normal to the detriment of various forms of asexual and non-sexual lives, relationships, and identities. So similarly, amatonormativity is introduced by Elizabeth Brake, who's a feminist scholar, and refers to the organization of life and love according to a hierarchy that prioritizes sexual and romantic couples. So the next three terms we're going to look at throughout the presentation, and they're going to organize most of the presentation. So the first one, I just want to note that sometimes asexuality, when I talk about asexuality, I'll talk about ace, and that refers to folks who are asexual. Aromanticism I'll talk about as aro, so again, referring to folks who are aro, and the erotic/erotics we'll get more into in a second. So most commonly, asexuality is understood as the lack of sexual attraction to others, or low or absent interest in or desire for sexual activity. Online asexual communities include the online platform Avon, groups on Facebook, tweeting chains on Twitter, as well as blogs and social networking sites such as Reddit and Tumblr. Offline, asexual organizing happens locally and internationally, including through meetups, conferences, pride parades, zine publications, and an annual Asexual Awareness Week, which is held in the last week of October. And you'll see on the slide I have here that I have images from two zines. One is Taking the Cake by Maisha, which is free and available online. It's a very great introductory zine on asexuality that is very effective at increasing kind of the level of understanding around asexuality. And the second zine here, An Aromantic Manifesto, really exciting zine that that is a very politicized kind of manifesto around aromanticism and includes really beautiful art by a variety of folks, and also available for free online. So challenging the idea that everyone is sexual, ace online and offline communities also generate other vocabularies and understandings of thinking about attraction and sexuality. Importantly, romantic and aromantic contribute another axis to how we imagine attraction between individuals. Aromantic individuals are colloquially known as aros, and aromanticism indicates low romantic attraction to others. Aromantic identity troubles amatonormativity, or the organization of life and love, according to a hierarchy that prioritizes sexual and romantic couples. Romantic asexuality includes an interest in building romantic, if not sex-based, relationships with others, which may include kissing, touching, and cuddling. Romantic and aromantic are also relevant descriptors for people who are not asexual, as they can help to grasp an aspect of the manner in which people are attracted to each other, rather than assuming that attraction relies only upon the desire to have sex. Because of the central role that sex has played within determining sexual identity has been understood as based on sexual attraction, or the idea that it is the desire to have sex with someone that is the key deciding factor of which sexual identity one classifies as, rendering other forms of attraction non-diacritical differences, to draw on Eve Sedgwick's words. Asexual and aromantic organizing also presents opportunities for spectrum and umbrella-based approaches to asexual identification, that draw on Keynesian ideas of orientation as based on degrees rather than fixed points. Alfred Kinsey outlined a model for thinking sexual orientation based on the degree to which one was attracted to one gender or another, with gender understood on a binary model, demonstrating the extent to which most people fall within the bisexual range. Asexual communities draw on the spectrum concept to put forward additional forms of spectrum-based identification, including a sexual-asexual axes. Gray asexuality, or gray A, thus refers to people who fall on the asexual end of the sexual-asexual axes, including those who are asexually identified yet who sometimes experience sexual attraction to others. Similarly, the romantic-aromantic axis also asks that everyone, whether aromantic or not, think about their level of romantic attraction. Gray romantic thus relates to people on the aromantic end of the spectrum. Demisexual, in turn, refers to people who experience some sexual attraction to those they are intimately bonded with first. And demiromantic is when a person develops romantic attraction only after they develop emotional closeness with another person. Spectrum labels such as gray A present opportunities for troubling a stark division between people who are sexual and asexual, and romantic and aromantic, because they challenge the sexual presumption and romantic presumption, or the idea that being romantic and sexual are the default and neutral modes of being. As asexual writer Julie Sandra Decker indicates, another term that challenged the assumed neutrality around being sexual is allosexual, or alloerotic in Sedgwick's words, which has been in use by ace communities to refer to people who are sexual, so not asexual. Similarly, alloromantic can refer to people who are romantic. So again, it troubles that kind of presumed neutrality of the label of being sexually attracted to others or romantically attracted to others. Ace and Aro community and organizing also stresses the importance of envisioning asexual and aromantic identity as part of queer and LGBTQ2IA+ organizing. Asexuality and aromanticism, or orientations that cut across other sexual identities, such that in addition to identifying as ace and/or aro, one can also identify as bisexual, lesbian, gay, pansexual, or straight, as well as monogamous or polyamorous. Many ace and aro identified individuals are transmasculine, transfeminine, genderqueer, non-binary, and agender. Further, if we think of queerness as not only a matter of gender of object choice, but also one of non-normative intimacies and the political challenging of oppressive straight, cisgender, racist, misogynist, and ableist contexts, asexuality can be understood as queer in the sense that it responds to ideas that bind compulsory sexuality with normality, or the idea that so-called healthy and normal people need to have sex. Similarly, aromanticism troubles the static nature of the dyadic couple as a central relational element. A final definitional element arising from asexual communities, and there are many more as well, I'm just mentioning a few, is the idea of different approaches to sex and sexuality. Sociologist Mark Kerrigan observed that there are three general dynamics among asexual people: sex positivity, sex neutrality, and sex repulsion. In this sense, some asexual people experience repulsion to sex, while others love that you love sex, as David J. shouted to onlookers at a San Francisco Pride Parade featured in the documentary Asexual from 2011. We can also see the three approaches in the opening three artists I began with: Agnes Martin and Andy Warhol perhaps being sex neutral, and Yayoi Kusama perhaps being sex repulsed. So we've talked about the toolkit, we've talked about asexuality and aromanticism. Now I want to turn to the concept of the erotic, which is central in my book and also central to today's thinking together. So the word erotics derives from the ancient Greek eros, and too often is passed down through a Freudian tradition, so that it has signified sexual passion, sexual energy, and sexual life force. For Sigmund Freud, all creative world-making was at its heart motivated by a sexual energy, so much so that he envisioned artistic creation as sublimation of the sexual instinct, the transmutation of a sexual life force into creative action in the world. Further, even the absence of sexual attraction, or what we might think of asexuality as asexuality today, was conceived of by Freud and the continued legacies of his contributions as a repression of the sexual drive, rendering asexual people as people who are unwilling or unable to recognize themselves as sexual. This harmful idea continues to inform how asexual people are perceived. Fascinatingly, Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's own daughter, seems to have been an asexual lesbian living in a non-sexual relationship with Dorothy Tiffany Burlingham for 50 years. As Kevin Murphy discusses in his recent work on psychoanalysis and asexuality, Freud saw it as his mission to drive her libido from the hiding place into which it had crawled, unable as he was to recognize asexuality. Yet a different tradition of thinking erotics is also available, one that is feminist, lesbian, and anti-racist, that of Audre Lorde. In her essay, Uses of the Erotic is Power, Audre Lorde puts forward a multifarious understanding of erotics that breaks with Freudian erotics by centralizing the racialized lesbian body and feminist anti-racist struggle. Audre Lorde was a poet, novelist, educator, and organizer who carved out spaces of imagining the interlocking identities of being a Black feminist, a lesbian, a mother, and a woman. On the one hand, Lorde was anything but asexual, as her journals, poetry, and biographer Alexis DeVoe speak to her relishing of sex, sexual love, and sexual seduction in her friendship groups and feminist circles. Yet on the other hand, Lorde wrote and talked about erotics in a way that did not bind emotional depth and intimate relating to sex. There is nowhere more clear than in her essay, Uses of the Erotic, which Lorde wrote 4 weeks before she found out she had breast cancer in 1978 for the 4th Berkshire Conference on the History of Women held at Mount Holyoke College. Sorry, that was supposed to be, this is nowhere more clear. Writing against what she calls the superficially erotic, Lorde opens up space for a deep intimacy that is not reliant only on sex and sexuality for meaning, but that finds satisfaction in a myriad of other activities and relationships to the self and to others. Like with Freud, the erotic is an inner resource of power that fuels action and intimacy in the world. In distinction to Freud, however, Lorde's erotic is not a sexually motivated energy, instinct, or drive, making conceptual space for asexuality in a way that sexuality does not. If anything, it is the reverse. The erotic fuels sexual desire, rather than sexual desire being at the base of the erotic. Sublimation in this sense, drawing on a Lordean framework, is not the sublimation of sexual desires or a sexual drive into other life pursuits, but rather involves the transference of the erotic into various activities, sex included. This transformative understanding of the erotic, rather than sexual desire, as at the base of all creativity, marks Lorde's work as an intervention in Freudian-based understandings of the flows of desire and the well from which they spur. The erotic is the nurturer or nursemaid of all our deepest knowledge, Lorde wrote, a profound source of knowing otherwise. In turn, the erotic is not obsessed with sexuality, sexual compartmentalization, or even sexuality's generation of identities from sexology henceforth. It is skeptical of, in Lorde's words, the European-American tradition, where need is satisfied by certain prescribed erotic comings together, that is, restrict the erotic to the bedroom alone. In this sense, a Lordean erotic challenges the centralization of erotic activity under the act of sex. A Lordean erotic is suspicious of sexuality as it exists in Western paradigms because it has marginalized and erased other forms of knowing and sensing, while being, in Lorde's words, misnamed by men and used against women. In these ways, Lorde mounts a challenge to sexology-derived and Freud-derived popularizations of the erotic that conflated with sexuality. Lorde instead articulates the erotic as expressed in several ways: through relationality or sharing deeply any pursuit with another person, through allowing for joy and the knowledge of being capable of joy, through a knowledge of the self and a life lived with an attunement to an inner knowledge, and also with a commitment to refusing unjust deployments of erotics that make others tools of our own pleasure. Lordean erotics sees erotics and a critique of injustice as interconnected. To quote more extensively from Lorde, the principal horror of any system which defines the good in terms of profit rather than in terms of human need, or which defines human need to the exclusion of the psychic and emotional components of that need. The principal horror of such a system is that it robs our work of its erotic value, its erotic power, and life appeal. In this way, the erotic is suggestive of a life energy of refusal and revolt, a critique of systems of oppression that strive to make one's labor, love, or time utilizable for the gain of others, thereby sapping one's erotic life energies. In this sense as well, the erotic is about developing erotic agency, the power to define, redefine, name, and assert in the face of social and discursive structures that encourage us to get in line, to tread a path, to be straightened into cooperation. Yet a Lordean erotic is also about the mundane and the erotic thrill of doing things for the self and others, deeply and with purpose, whether they be dancing, building a bookcase, writing a poem, examining an idea. Those are Lorde's words. It is through this variety of activities as meaningful that another asexual erotic is opened, attesting to the ways in which sex can be de-emphasized as the most deep, meaningful, or erotic activity out there. What would it mean if social understandings of sexuality saw these actions, dancing, building a bookcase, writing a poem, examining an idea, as erotic, rather than affixing erotics to sex? So in the final part of today's talk, I want to look at reasons why we should be including ace and aro perspectives into our erotic toolkit. So first of all, asexuality challenges the pathologization of low sexual desire and low sexual behavior. Asexuality, like other sexual identities, has been a pathologized sexual identity. Historically, there has been a host of diagnoses that pathologize low levels of sexual desire. For example, low sexual desire has, since the 19th century, been captured with such terms as sexual anesthesia, sexual coldness, frigidity, and inhibited sexual desire, and more recently, as hypoactive sexual desire disorder, and with the DSM 5th edition as female sexual interest arousal disorder, and male hypoactive sexual desire disorder. This pathologization of asexuality is bad for everyone, not just asexual people, because it creates undue pressure for us to be sexual, regardless of how we feel, our experiences with trauma, and our relationship to sex. The pathologization of asexuality also undermines other relational forms as equally valuable, such as intimate friendships and platonic life partners. Placing asexual contributions in your toolkit helps push back against a medical model that tends to pathologize low sexual desire. Making space for aromantic contributions in your erotic toolkit helps develop a critique of amatonormativity. Amatonormativity, as mentioned, is Elizabeth Brake's concept for naming the belief that marital and amorous relationships should be valued over friendships, leaving so-called singled folks out in the cold while potentially reproducing toxic relationships. Amatonormativity pressures us to navigate life in the form of romantic, dyadic units, the couple as a source of life protection and as a privatized unit. It encourages us to fall in love heterosexually, to reproduce heterosexually, and to live out our lives in the units we form. It is only with the contributions of aromanticism that we can challenge these relational structures that have been pre-assigned to us and that we are all in different ways expected to fulfill. So, third, making space for asexual contributions in your erotic toolkit also helps develop a deeper critique of compulsory sexuality. The concept of compulsory sexuality, as mentioned earlier, has been a central contribution of asexuality organizing and research. As a term, it draws on Adrienne Rich's rich concept of compulsory heterosexuality to index the ways in which sexuality, like heterosexuality, is assumed to be original, primary, prevalent, preferred, and superior, and thus socially rewarded and bolstered to the detriment of other sexualities. Importantly, compulsory sexuality is a system that encourages some people to have sex, even while banning marginalized groups and communities from sexual expression through the process of desexualization. So locating asexuality in our toolkits also asks that we undertake an intersectional analysis of compulsory sexuality. Desexualization, as Anjung Kim's work on asexuality explores, functions to render marginalized groups such as people with disabilities, lesbians and transgender people, children and older adults, people of size, and some racialized people as asexual by default, misusing the term asexuality in the process. Desexualization includes, for example, aggressive discourses around people with disabilities not being capable of sex or not being desirable. Desexualization is also in relation to hypersexualization. Ayanna Hawkins Owen discusses how compulsory sexuality has uneven racial histories, such that whiteness has tended to emulate an asexuality as ideal. For example, if we think of clergy or kind of white women's purity myths, as demonstrative of a form of innocence, moral control, and restraint, while Black people have often been positioned as hypersexualized so as to justify enslavement, lynching, rape, and other instruments of racism. Hypersexualization and desexualization have thus been used historically and are in the present used as forms of social regulation and oppression. So while it is fair to argue that sex is encouraged, compulsory sexuality also rests on the white, ableist, and heteronormative hope and expectation that some people will not have sex, and the implementation of tactics for curtailing sex for those deemed dangerous to a nation state. Historically and in the present, this has been gay people, queer people, people of color, disabled people, aging people. Asexuality can thus invite examinations of the intersectional histories and present-day realities of compulsory sexuality. And finally, returning to the beginning of this presentation, including asexuality and aromanticism in our erotic toolkits helps us to remain open to finding asexuality and aromanticism where it has previously been ignored, and appreciating asexuality and aromanticism as part of the queer critique of heteronormativity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was super interesting, I think. And I hope our listeners agree. So are there any questions that you have at the moment? If you'd like to take a few moments to think about it, to think about what to ask. As Marta said in the beginning, feel free to either ask your questions in the chat if you prefer that to speaking up, or if you would like to speak up, I'll be happy to shut up and let you ask your questions in audio, or you can also indicate that you'd like to say something in the chat, and then we'll also turn the mic over to you, so to speak. So I'll give you a few moments to decide. Okay, we have a lot of enthusiastic voices of thanks, but no questions as far as I can see so far.
I have to say, it's so nice that so many people I know who are like not in Poland are also, maybe the time is ripe, maybe 10 a.m. is a good hour for 11 a.m. or noon, but it's really nice to see everyone. Thank you for coming. It's so kind of you to come out and support.
Quite exciting.
Oh, Edmonton. Yeah, so I can answer anything. I can also, if you want to challenge me intellectually and like keep me sharp, you can ask me a question in Polish and I will answer in English. I can try to do that too. Or you can answer, you can ask in English, of course, as well.
So if I can ask a question, and then move over, but I feel empowered because like I'm the host. Can you speak a bit more to potential political uses of asexuality in this kind of traditional meaning of politics? I understand kind of challenging medicalization of asexuality. This would be an obvious one. I wondered what else could be there, if you have any thoughts. It's not like you didn't address it in your talk, but I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts here. I mean, the example that is really potent to look at is how asexuality has been used historically as a political identity. So not to say that asexuality isn't used now as a political identity, but when something is a sexual orientation, it's like it can be a political identity, but that's secondary. The main thing is, you know, the part of expressing who you are, the part that, like in that orientation model, that this is part of who you are, right? So a lot of ace folks have been like upset by using asexuality in this politicized way, because it's like, you know, you don't have to do that if you're sexual, or like you don't have to make a case for your sexuality as a politicized thing. But at the same time, there's like really interesting examples historically and like up until the present day of various deployments of like either low sexual desire or low sexual behavior being used for political reasons specifically. And the examples that come to mind that I've written about are around feminist politics in the 60s and 70s, when lots of folks were using asexuality kind of as a way for many reasons, but including to separate themselves from cisgender men, to find community with each other, as usually as cisgender women, but not only, and to really carve out different ways of thinking about relating to each other that were independent on sex. So there's like, I write about it in the first chapter, but like figures like Dana Densmore and the Cell 16 group, like they explicitly talked about the uses of asexuality for building feminism in North America. Because remember, like, you know, if we start thinking even in the early 60s, the pill is not so widely available. And so much of having sex, heterosexual sex, links up to actually, you know, perhaps being forced into reproduction. And the link there. So it was, and then also once like sexuality was freed up in like the 60s, for some people, of course, for heterosexual people mostly, and like part of that hippie culture, there was this new pressure created for actually women to perform sex as often as men wanted, you know, on cisgender terms. And so there, of course, so like that moment was so important politically for thinking asexuality as a politics of resistance, because there was so much, the social and historical conditions were such that like sex was so often linked with exploitation in these really direct ways. And of course, you know, today there has been so many movements of claiming sex as a site of pleasure and power, which it is as well, but which were not as readily available discursively, I think, especially to feminists of that era, for the reasons that sex just signified differently. It was linked to like being heterosexual. It was linked to having a family, to reproducing children, to having sex that wasn't about your pleasure, that wasn't about your orgasm, that was really kind of centered on this teleology of like masculine desire. So that's, you know, one example when it was really potent, but I think it's been used throughout historically. Like even things like perhaps sex strikes could be used to think about various politics of like not having sex. Of course, the important distinction is that it's not like the same thing as asexuality, but it is like, if we think about broadly the politics of sexual refusal, there's resonances there.
Ela, we have a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you can see them or if you'd prefer me to read them out loud.
Yes, I can see them. So the first is here. What do you think of asexual representation in movies, TV? I feel like it is often shown as a problem. Yes, I mean, totally. It's so often is shown as a problem. The main narratives are like that, that people are repressed, that people are lying into themselves, that there's a direct link between trauma and being asexual, that a person, there was even like weird rhetoric earlier around people being lazy, like they don't feel like having sex. So there's definitely have been really bad representations. There also have been improving representations to a certain extent. And part of that is linked actually to consulting with ace people and being like, oh, okay, this is what it's like, and this is what a meaningful and not offensive representation of asexuality looks like. Of course, consultations can also be used to exploit people. So, I mean, it can go in various ways, but like folks often talk about BoJack Horseman as being a really positive representation of asexuality. But I'm not necessarily up to date on all the pop culture stuff, but Anna will probably know a lot more because she does work on pop culture too. But there are lots of good examples now, but still definitely not enough. And still the themes that are readily picked up by people are the negative ones. Like I had the pleasure of talking to David J a few days ago over the phone, and he's a big part of the asexuality movement and started AVEN. And he talked about how like, yeah, when he started doing work, people would just like go at him with these really aggressive questions as to like, this is impossible, but how can you even? So I think we've moved a little bit away from that for the most part. I don't think most people think it's impossible anymore. The other really weird thing is that like, it's hard to think of it as impossible because when you talk to someone more deeply, they seem to always know a person who is like kind of asexual or on the asexual spectrum. So it's like saying gayness is impossible. And then they're like, my uncle. And you're like, okay. Okay, so hold on. The other questions. All right.
Yeah, thank you. We have two more, I think, in the chat. Oh, or even more than that. And we have a whole discussion happening. That's exciting.
Yes. It is. So the next question is that I am very interested in the difference between sex repulsion and sex aversion, because I used to think of these terms as interchangeable. Yeah, that's really cool. I don't know if I really have a lot of things to say. I think those things definitely need to be explored further. I mean, one thing I will say is that it's not impossible for, who we are sexually to be linked to trauma. So it is very possible that like Yayoi Kusama had traumatic links to that caused her to really fear phalluses, right? And be averse to sex. At the same time, it's kind of like impossible to tease out because trauma can just constitute who you are sexually regardless of our orientation. So I don't know. I feel like some people would answer that question by saying one is more trauma oriented and the other isn't, but I don't know if I necessarily agree with that either. So I'm not really sure. I'm curious to know if the asker of this question wanted to share any ideas they had. I'd be really interested to hear, but I also understand if that's not a pleasant
actually, we do have one. We do have a reply from Mary Kim-Gnodda, right? She saying that that for many people these terms are interchangeable, but some people prefer repulsed because it refers to a stronger level of discomfort than averse. So this is also sort of a native. I would suppose this is also a question of like native speakers' associations with the terms, right?
Yeah, really cool. Thank you for that contribution. Awesome.
And adding that, sorry, so just to finish this thought, and adding that some of it is just a difference in locations of conversations. Some communities mostly use one term or the other. So this might sort of depend, and this is also, I think, a very interesting comment on the importance of locating your conversations on asexuality, just like on anything else, right? Sort of specifically and attending to these like details and like chronologies in some way.
Okay, cool. Should I address another question?
Yeah, Natalia Walacka, I think, is the next question that we have on the list.
Okay. So can you say a few words about queer platonic relationships and maybe its place in the hierarchy of romantic relationships? Yeah, so I think queer platonic relationships I don't know the history of the existence of the term online, but it's arisen as a like really powerful term for queer folks who are very in close relation to each other and who are essentially life partners, but it's platonic in nature. The term also, from what I understand, holds meaning for a lot of aro folks, and it can be like a meaningful way to add weight to a relationship that isn't usually recognized. So, you know, I mean, you can also do that, of course, with things like girlfriend or boyfriend or partner, but with queer platonic, the idea is that it's not necessarily romantic based and it's not necessarily sexually based. It's more about being in close relation to another person and really building your lives around each other, which if you think about is not that unusual. There's like examples of this throughout history. Maybe even Anna Freud's example that I mentioned before could fit into this. And I've had these relationships before, and they feel, you know, equally meaningful and equally real. And unfortunately, the word platonic is often demoted socially, so that it's meant to feel like it's not real enough. So we have a comment here that I'm just going to read again from Mary Kane Ganoza. For background on queer platonic, it's in part about queering the idea that platonic relationships must be hierarchically less important than romantic ones. So in some ways, it's about rejecting the romantic over non-romantic relationship hierarchy. Definitely, yeah. So yeah, and like reassessing how is that things get to count as a relationship in the first place, and this pressure to, you know, be in a romantic couple or being in romantic relationships with others as taking priority and as the thing that we're supposed to be excited about, supposed to put all our energy into, supposed to organize our lives around. When, like I was saying, there are so many models of people who like intimate friendships or queer platonic relationships of living together, building closeness together, building lives together that aren't centered around romance. Okay, so
I think the next question is from Tristan Miller.
Okay, cool. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the interaction between academics and people in the ACE community. What advantages can we gain from greater interaction, and how could we engage that? Yeah, this is a really important question. And I think, I mean, so I'm in the tradition of like feminist and queer work. At the same time, you know, one would think that feminist and queer work is more about self-reflexivity, is more about a community engagement, but of course, and that, you know, more science-based traditions are less about that, but that hasn't always been true, of course. A lot of literary scholarship, literary theory tends to be kind of like talking on this different level that isn't very relatable for people outside of the academy. So this is a question that I have navigated throughout writing on asexuality. So I am part of the ACE community. At the same time, of course, I cannot be a voice for everyone, and nor should I be. So it is a really weird position to like write a book on asexuality and want to make a convincing point to why feminists and queer scholars should care, because too often they just have not, to be honest with you, while at the same time doing it in ways that are respectful. So I definitely have some regrets about things I could have done better. I also am proud of some of the things that I have done. One really positive experience I had was when I was living in Vancouver. I had a chance to be involved with ACE folks in Vancouver, which was really wonderful. And it was a chance also to give back, namely to do workshops for ACE folks on like things that weren't too hard for me to access, but might be harder for them to access. The model that I really like that has come up in recent years, there's lots of like ethical models for doing research in feminist and queer scholarship, but one I really like comes from Moya Bailey, and the article is called Transform the Age. And basically she talks about, specifically she works with the community of trans women of color and what they kind of, the knowledge they produce on Twitter. And so she herself is not a trans woman, and she talks about collaboration as being the integral component. So seeing that the work created is not so much representative of the community, but that it's done in collaboration to some degree with the community, and that the community can also benefit from it. So I think that as a model makes a lot of sense. So benefits can include various things. They can include things like sharing research broadly, you know, trying to destroy the paywall, for example. They can include things like using institutional funds towards funding things. So like, for example, when I was in Vancouver, I got to organize this exciting conference on asexuality, and I used institutional funds to be able to provide food and space. And that was a really exciting moment that felt like was very collaborative. So I think the main thing is that it's an ongoing process. It's never like a check mark that you tick off. It always has to be like ongoing accountability and exchange. And I think using like rich models of collaboration that are, really invested in like thinking about how can people who are variously positioned benefit from the research that is done. And of course, no one piece of research is going to be loved by all or is going to benefit all. That's impossible, but it can be done in ways that like are engaged, and that, you know, if you think about that as part of the process and make actions towards that, and that can be throughout. It can be during research, during publication, after. I think it's an ongoing process.
Thank you. The next question on the list is from Koi.
Okay. So you mentioned some oversights in queer theory with recognizing asexuality and aromanticism. So I was wondering, in an academic context, have you run into any pushback from queer feminist scholars when introducing either of these? Or has the reception been mostly positive? So I would say if the reception has been mostly neutral / not caring, which I would say is a pretty negative reception. It's not actively negative, but it's kind of passively negative. I mean, it sort of astounds me how little people care about this. Not to say that, you know, lots of other things shouldn't be cared about or should take priority perhaps, but it's just like, it's a weird thing, right? When you're working on something for a long time, and and most queer and feminist folks don't really care unless they are ace or era, right? Especially ace, because most of my research, my research is on asexuality. And there have been instances of negative things. I mean, I've been told things like, you know, this isn't like hugely detrimental, but it's things that kind of like hurt your feelings and make you think about the construction of a field and what's included and what's excluded. Like, I've been told that I don't really do sexuality studies, and it's just like, what does that even mean? Like, okay. Or that I've been told that asexuality isn't real, and that people wouldn't support the project because of that. So, you know, things like that, lots of kind of just not, I don't know, not treating it very seriously, I guess. So that is really devastating. So I think there is like, I wouldn't say it's pushback per se, but I would just say it's kind of like malaise and disinterest. This kind of atmosphere would be the general stuff. But I do think things have changed. Like, since I started doing this work, more people have cared. And certainly ace and aro communities are growing and are active. And that's another really great thing, is that the unique thing about doing research on asexuality is that people will read your work. Ace people will read your work, and they will have opinions, and they will blog about it online. And, you know, whether or not you agree with them, so there is interaction, but I haven't seen a lot of engagement with folks in academia, to be honest with you. That might be for many reasons. I'm not a super well-known prominent scholar in the US, right? If I was maybe better institutionally situated in like an Ivy League or something, maybe that would be different. So there's a lot of reasons that can come up for this, but in general, I would say disinterest is the negative affect.
We have a few comments. We have a comment from Alexandra saying that there was a documentary where an asexual girl was sort of met with negative reactions, even in the LGBT community, which I think also sort of adds to our picture of that. So thanks for that. I just want to share a really short anecdote on that very topic of your institutional reactions to working on asexuality. So paradoxically, Poland might be a great place to work on that, because, as I found out a few years ago, I'm quite well able to sell asexuality both as a progressive and as a conservative project. So, you know, obviously, like, I'm being ironic here, and I do consider it to be part of, like, you know, queer studies and gender studies, sexuality studies in its progressive meaning. But when I was applying for a grant to go over to the US to study it, the panel of people judging my application was really pushing me in this, like, conservative, okay, so it's basically like celibacy direction. And I was like, well, not really, but sure, why not? I mean, if that's what it takes for you to give me the money to go and study it, yes. And it does have some, like, interesting overlaps there. So, you know, it's a sort of one of those topics that can be twisted any way you need, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a really weird thing. I've also had someone say this to me before. So right now I'm residing in Alberta, and this is where I did some of my graduate training as well. And Alberta is a fairly conservative province when it comes to Canadian provinces. So, and I was also told that I could potentially get good funding for my work because people can misread it as like an expression of religious conservative beliefs. And I was like, what? But what's really funny is that asexuality also really upsets religious conservatives because, and it depends on how it operates. So like Hawkins Owen's work talks about how this idea of asexuality as a white ideal that is like this like thing of like white moral restraint and like white superiority and like the history perhaps of clergy in Catholicism not being sexually active, of course, even though they are, and of nuns refusing, and of like ideas of morality of the 19th century, and like women, like, you know, why women restraining themselves from being sexual as an expression of like their like upper class status. So there's like all these really weird things there. But then like the minute it becomes upsetting for people, even with whiteness, is when it's people feel like your body should be available to others, and it's not. That's when it becomes upsetting. So like, if you're like, let's say in a heterosexual context, and like one person is asexual and the other isn't, it becomes this issue to address very aggressively, because there's this way in which you're not like living up to the expectations of what a relationship should require. You're not sort of doing your part. In fact, like there's even legal considerations. Like you could have a marriage annulled, right, if there is no sex. Like there are these different, like it's this weird thing, like it's okay if this, but it's not okay if that. So like there's like margins of acceptance for differently positioned people, but also like people get angry for various reasons, like, you know, obviously, as we know, like even incel movements, which have nothing to do with asexuality, just to be clear, nothing. There's a lot of this aggressive belief of entitlement to people's bodies, to women's bodies. And, but not only, also to like, the bodies of others, and like being better than other people's bodies. And like there's all those weird politics rest basically on compulsory sexuality and this idea that certain people should be sexually available for other people. And at that moment, if you're asexual, it's very upsetting. Like, how dare you not make your body available for consumption in the way that, you know, you're supposed to.
Do we have any other questions? Would anybody else like to ask something in the chat or in audio? So I have one question that if nobody else comes up with anything, I suppose we can finish there. But just so to give you all a last call for questions, and in the meantime, let me ask mine. I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about this, about the relationship between asexuality and aromanticism in the context of asexuality studies, because I think even the fact that we by and large call it asexuality studies as opposed to aro studies or any other variation thereof, speaks to how asexuality is centered sort of in this debate. And you know, we talk a lot about making sure to include aromantic perspectives, and you did that in showing the zines, but I was wondering how you saw that relationship in research.
Yeah, that's a great question. And also, Mary Kamenoza here also asks a similar thing. She writes, or they write, I'm not sure if this is within your specific areas of interest, but do you see any potential for the study of aromanticism, specifically outside of asexuality studies? And then she writes, or they write, Anna beat me to it. Yeah, so definitely. I mean, so far there's been, and I've had excellent pushback on this, and I've learned a lot from that pushback. Recently, I co-authored a piece on ace and aro zines with a former student of mine, Kaya Jacob, and the piece is forthcoming with this great journal, QED, a journal of GLBT world making, or maybe GLBTQ world making, or maybe it's a journal on GLBTQ world making. Anyways, and we received that pushback too. And it's, I mean, the thing is that what happens is that aromanticism is appended, right? It's like the way that it just becomes appended. It's like asexuality and then a few things on aromanticism. And I've certainly done this too. I mean, there's, I'm totally implicated in this. So I think, though, what's important is aromanticism does present a totally different set of critiques that are linked to asexuality, but that are also distinct. So, for example, with heteronormativity, which is a concept developed not by an aro person, but by a feminist philosopher. I don't think they're aro anyways, or she's aro. Looking at, it's more of like linked to polyamorous critique a little bit, because you critique relational structures, and you critique the premium placed on romance as kind of the glue that's supposed to hold relational structures together. So there's clear parallels with asexuality and like seeing sex as this glue and compulsory sexuality. But I think it is a different thing, and I do think it needs to be studied independently of. And I haven't really seen that yet, and I'm looking forward to when that does happen. I have had students who have done this work, which was exciting to see. And I know that it's getting a lot more, some communities are, have really strong aro representation, and like the creating spaces in conjunction with asexuality, but not under the same umbrella. So it's like ace and aro, not the same thing. And of course, just as a quick note, you can be, of course, aro and still be sexual. So those are separate kind of mechanisms that I think do need a lot more work. And it has been generally dealt with as a thing that you append, as opposed to as a thing that is robustly kind of examined and thought with on its own, which I'm sure will happen, but I haven't seen a lot of it yet. I mean, in terms of published research, I've seen a lot of it otherwise. The zine I recommended does an excellent job of this, and it's available for free online. And that zine is called an Aromantic Manifesto.
Let me actually send you a link, because I did Google it in the meantime as you were speaking. So let me send you a link in the chat. Okay, so Ela, thank you so much for your lecture and for being so generous with us in the Q&A, and for fielding all of those questions that came from many different directions. But I think this also gave us a chance to take a look at asexuality studies from a few different perspectives as well. So I hope everyone enjoyed that as well. So thank you so much from myself and from everybody here at the American Studies Center, and I'll leave Marta to it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ela, and thank you so much, Anna, for I think we finished this American Studies Colloquium series with a bang. It was a new mode of doing this. Normally, or without a pandemic, we would all be at the American Studies Center. We shall see what happens next semester. The talk series is going to continue. We will just see whether it's in a virtual lecture hall or the actual lecture hall. We try to have all of our presentations recorded and made available online on the center's YouTube channel. So for those of you from abroad, if you cannot make it to a specific talk, at our department, you can then listen to it later on. Again, thank you everyone who joined us, both our American Studies Center students, faculty, as well as our guests from all over, and hope to see many of you next time we kick off our talk series, which is probably going to be somewhere around October. So please kind of follow what we're doing. There will be many interesting talks, and I hope that we get to see you, Ela, present also. And thank you. So this is
I
it.
hope so. I still have the vouchers because the airlines won't pay me back, so there's a good chance.
Brilliant. Yes, we would love to have you at the center. I still fetishize the kind of physicality of doing work kind of in person and listening to people in person. But you know, worst case scenario, we can always repeat this.